So I wanted to talk a little bit about Greenland and why I feel that it represents a major change in the world order. I'll start by saying that when everybody heard Donald Trump was talking about buying Greenland, I think most of us thought it was a bit of a joke, but I think it was also maybe quite revealing because it showed there's a lot behind the scenes that I think a lot of us maybe might have missed. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about Greenland itself because obviously there's a lot of information in the public domain around it, but maybe for the purposes of the video I'd like to just give a little bit of an overview of that will maybe provide some context to some of the points I want to make and also maybe just fill in some of the blanks. So Greenland is a self-governing territory. It's part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and between Denmark and Greenland there's a sort of a clear delineation of responsibility. Denmark providing things like a significant part of Greenland's budget. Greenland is handling things like natural resources, education, environmental policing, environmental regulation, those sort of things. And Denmark is obviously responsible for things such as foreign affairs, defense, currency, citizenship. Greenland also has the right to declare independence through referendum at any stage. So ultimately any changes that involve Greenland's status must involve Greenland and obviously Denmark as well. And also any status regarding anything regarding mining, environmental rights would have to involve Greenland primarily, but also then Denmark because Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Independence is a long-term goal for many Greenlanders, but it's not something that has got major support at the moment. And it's also not something that really gets talked about that often in Greenland. Most of the elections and most of the discussion centers around things like mining, environmental regulations and environmental concerns. When we talk about US-Denmark relations, specifically as they relate to Greenland, there's two agreements that need to be considered. So the first is the 1917 Lansing Declaration, and this took place when the US bought what is now the US Virgin Islands, at the time was known as the Danish West Indies, and they bought those from Denmark. And that declaration from the US made quite clear that the US recognizes and would not oppose Danish sovereignty over Greenland. The second is the 1951 Defense Agreement between the US and Denmark. And now one of the big sort of consequences or results of this is the Pituffik Space Base, which is operated by the US Space Force, and that's where the US has based their long-range missile early warning systems and also their space surveillance, and also they conduct Arctic operations from that base as well. So this agreement gives the US military significant autonomy in the region in terms of carrying out defense operation or military operations. And there's a lot that they can kind of do without having to go through authority or approval with the Greenlandic and the Danish authorities. So when you look at these two agreements already, and you take them sort of together, the first one obviously is that the US is recognizing Denmark, Danish sovereignty over Greenland, and the second one is that the US, broadly speaking, can already do in the region what they claim they need to be able to do. So they claim that they need Denmark, they need Greenland in order to carry out military operations and to be able to protect North America as part of their Golden Dome. They can already do most of that. So broadly speaking, there isn't really anything more that they need to be able to do, or what they can do, based on the agreements that they already have in place. So, and the other claim made by the US is that they need to take Greenland because Denmark is incapable of protecting it from Russia or China. But Greenland is self-governing, it's part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and Denmark is a NATO member. So Greenland actually falls under the protection of NATO anyway. And secondly, if we look at Russia at the moment, Russia has been absolutely decimated in the Ukraine war. Significant parts of their fleet have actually been sunk. So their maritime capability has been degraded significantly. And yes, while the Arctic fleet is still quite strong, it's nowhere near where it was at Cold War strength. So there's no realistic threat posed by Russia when it comes to Greenland. And in any case, any Russian bases in the region are all quite legitimately located in Russian territory. So it's not like they are suddenly putting bases in Greenland or looking at putting a base in Greenland at all. And secondly, China. China, obviously they have a long-term aim to establish a Arctic presence, but I would argue that this is most likely going to come through Russia Far East, or what we would call Siberia. And this is something that has been discussed before, and I've written briefly about this. Those parts of Russia Far East, or what we call Siberia, actually used to be part of China, and they were signed over by China to Russia. And it's worth considering, because that is a point of contention in China, and it's what they might refer to as a national pain. So the other thing also worth considering is that the Trump administration recently released their national security strategy, which is effectively how they view the world and the US's security within the world. Greenland isn't explicitly named there in this agreement, in this declaration or the strategy, but it appears implicitly in three different areas. The first one is the great power competition, and the second one is the homeland defense and missile warning system, and the third is the Arctic and northern flank security. And where these three overlap is where Greenland is located. But as I mentioned earlier, the US already has the ability to carry out military operations and to expand their military operations in Greenland if they need to. And it's also worth mentioning that Denmark and the Greenlandic authorities have actually welcomed the US whenever there's a talk around increasing the military presence or military operations in the region. So it's not something that is a point of contention. They're quite happy to entertain that. And now we come to one of the main reasons that I think is the driving force behind Trump's desire on Greenland is rare earth minerals. Greenland does hold massive untapped reserves of rare earth minerals, but as I mentioned earlier, the Greenlandic authorities and the locals are very reluctant to tap into these. So, and the Greenlandic authorities, the leaders, have also stated that Greenland is not for sale. And polling and public support shows very, very little support for Greenland as becoming part of the US. So I think this is the big part that Trump doesn't like, is that because Greenland controls its own natural resources, Denmark controls foreign policy and defense, and mining requires environmental reviews, local consent, political approval, none of that happens quickly or unilaterally. So Greenland requires permission, and this is ultimately something that has to be given, and also something can be withdrawn as well from the US. So Trump has likely seen this as an obstacle. If the US owns Greenland, this becomes a non-issue, which is why Greenland matters so much to him. He doesn't want to have to ask permission to access those minerals, or if they want to substantially increase the military presence of Greenland. So I did earlier mention that the Danish authorities and the Greenlanders would be quite happy if they increased the presence, but obviously up to a point. And I think that might be the idea that having to ask for permission is something that Trump doesn't really want to entertain, I think, very much. So in his security worldview, Greenland isn't really a diplomatic issue, it's infrastructure, and it's about controlling supply chains. I want to address another thing that Trump has often criticized the EU for, and a lot of his supporters will too, is that the EU takes a long time to decide things. There's lots of talking, lots of decision-making cycles, consultation, compromise, things like that. But what, from Washington's perspective, looks like European weakness is in reality the price of cohesion in a multi-state system. You cannot judge the EU in the same way that you judge the US, because they are not the same kind of political entity. This isn't an excuse for Europe, it's just an explanation of how it survives. Because you have to consider that the EU has 27 member countries, and that's 27 different countries that have different cultures, different histories, different ways of doing things, different priorities, social issues, things like that. So preventing internal splits, maintaining legitimacy of the EU, and keeping the group together and aligned, that is the main priority of the EU. But when you view the EU through the lens of Donald Trump, you understand why he views it as weak. Because under Donald Trump, power is understood as speed, leverage, dominance, not asking for permission, doing whatever you want. If we look at his actions recently, with regards to tariffs, even the rendition of Maduro from Venezuela, those sort of things, they didn't have much approval or oversight before he put them into place. He just kind of went ahead and did them, and those sort of things wouldn't fly in a European country. They would probably be debated and decided upon. There would be discussions, roundtable discussions, meetings, those sort of things, where Trump just goes ahead and does it. I'm not here to say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's just the reality of how things are. It's a very different system. He sees negotiation as hesitation, consultation as paralysis, compromise as loss. But the reality is that Europe doesn't move slowly because it's weak. It moves slowly because it has to keep 27 countries aligned and together. So everybody that criticizes the EU is judging it as if it was a single nation state, which it isn't. It's a system, and it trades speed for stability. And now the reality is that Denmark and Europe, the EU, cannot comply with US demands because this would fracture internal trust, reward coercion, set a precedent for others to exploit. And when I say others, I'm looking specifically at Russia. And it would weaken the EU more than just saying no would. Now, there's also some similarities I'd like to touch on with regards to the war in Ukraine. Trump claimed here that he could end the war in 24 hours, and I think that a lot of his supporters actually believe that he could. Millions of people. But anybody with a basic understanding of European history knew that this was impossible, because you don't end existential wars with real estate logic. Ukraine isn't a business dispute, it's fighting for survival. And if Ukraine stops fighting, they cease to exist as a nation. Russia isn't negotiating over profits, it's fighting over identity, territory, and imperial relevance. And I think that this is, at the core of this is a fundamental difference in worldview, much the same as Greenland. Trump respects escalation, he respects strength, he respects force. Europe respects rules, processes, stability. So when Trump hears politeness, he sees weakness. When Europe hears aggression, they hear instability. That's different languages. But at the end of it, I don't think Greenland is about land or minerals. It's a stress test. It's a test to see whether Europe understands the kind of America that Trump represents, and whether Europe is willing to adapt to it or be sidelined. And I don't think Trump cares if he burns bridges. He's not asserting, he's asserting dominance. He's not building a system. And I think that's ultimately what this is about. Greenland's status hasn't changed. Its perceived strategic value has. And that's what's brought it to the center of global politics. Now, I know that there's been an update to this, and that Trump has had a meeting with Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, where he's claimed that he's reached an infinite deal. Now, I think this is something that's very important to look at, to say what kind of deal could realistically have been achieved here, because as the head of NATO, yes, he has a lot of power, but he doesn't have the power to force Greenland or Denmark to cede territory or to agree to certain terms that were not negotiated directly with them. So I think what's most likely happened is that Mark Rutte has explained to Trump what rights the US already had and what agreements were already in place, namely the 1951 Defense Pact and the 1917 Lansing Agreement. So, and those two agreements clearly outline, give a very clear framework for the relationship between Denmark, Greenland, and the US. So I don't think that Trump has actually walked away with much, other than a clearer understanding maybe of what the US's rights already were as they relate to Greenland. I do also think that there may have been a potential that the US was actually going to launch an invasion on Greenland, because we did see the 11th Airborne Division being mobilized from Alaska, and that is the US's only military asset that's capable of fighting in extreme cold weather. They do have cold weather units, but when we're talking about Greenland, we need an extreme cold weather fighting capability, and the 11th Airborne is the only unit in the US Army that was actually capable of doing that. They did say that they were mobilizing 3 battalions, so that's around 1,500 men, which is kind of what you would need for an invasion like this to establish a solid foothold on the island. They said that they were mobilizing them to send them to Minneapolis because of the protests there, but the National Guard would be able to fulfill this role better than the 11th Airborne. So I suspect this was being done under the guise of sending them to Minneapolis to assist with stability and law and order there, but the reality was that they were being mobilized to invade Greenland.